one thing caught my attention. So you mentioned the tendering process. We don't talk about this very often with the speakers I have on the show, but I think it's interesting to mention, especially for startups and innovators, when they're thinking how to get into the hospitals in Europe. Oftentimes the case is that basically hospitals need to have some sort of a dedicated budget for innovation where startups or just companies that are established even stand a chance. So what are your experiences in that sense? Like, what would your advice be in terms of how can innovation enter the hospital space in the Nordic?
Yeah, it's really difficult. When we started Confrere before the pandemic, we talked to both people in hospitals as well as in primary care, and there's a huge difference in, as I mentioned, in the way they're organized. In the primary care, it's mostly individual practitioners who can decide themselves what tool to purchase, etc. So they don't have any tendering processes, but they're still paid by the government through the standardized remuneration. Whereas hospitals, they have budgets and they need to run tenders for everything that has any significant economic impact. They do have budgets for innovation though, so it's completely possible to run innovation projects with them as a startup, and often fairly easy to get started with that. But I would say that you might see that as a trap, because if you get into an innovation project with a hospital, then you're really focusing on a hospital use case and you're collaborating with the hospital people. But at some point, you have to turn that into real business. And to turn that into real business, the hospital has to run a tender. They can't just take what they did in an innovation project and turn it into a real project. So this means that there's a lot of innovation projects and pilots going on in hospitals, but not so many purchases. We call it the pilot illness.
You actually have that expression. You actually use that expression.
There's an expression that's called pilot illness, pilotsyke, yes. And it's basically that there's a lot of pilots that happens, but not so many actual deployments. And getting over that is a real significant hurdle that's really difficult to get across. Our strategy in Confrere was to avoid the problem by focusing on primary care first and foremost. And the thesis was that if we can get primary care to start using video consultations, then we will eventually also get the hospitals. We did manage that. We did get helped by a pandemic, so maybe it's necessary to have a pandemic to make it happen. But hopefully it isn't.